Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on closing the gender export gap, evidence from Scotland and beyond. My name is Pinar Gunes, and I'm a trade economist and an assistant professor at the University of Sussex, and I'm delighted to chair this session and looking forward to the discussions. So today we will discuss gender export gap research report, which is recently published by the Scottish Government to better understand what is holding women back from exporting and the difference their increased participation in trade could make in Scotland's economy. And we're very fortunate to have three excellent panelists who have been at the heart of such discussions. So we have Monika Dybowski from the Scottish Government, Dr. Stephen Knox from Stirling Business School, and finally Jane Korinek from the OECD. Monika will start off with a brief background on the report. She'll then hand over to Stephen, who will speak about for 10 minutes, giving us an overview of the key findings from the report, and again, hand over to Monika, who will conclude the findings of the report. Following their presentation, Jane will provide a broader international perspective on gender and trade, and he will discuss studies at global, regional, and country levels that outline how women and men are affected differently by international trade and policies that can support women business leaders in their journeys on international markets. Thank you all for joining, and Monika, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Pinar, for that introduction. So as Pinar said, I'm here to talk about the Scottish Government's research on the gender export gap. So it's this global phenomenon whereby women-led businesses are exporting less than their male counterparts. And I'm really delighted that Stephen Knox, who's one of the co-authors of this research, is able to join me today. I just want to say that I'm really thrilled that Jane Korinek is here today as well, because her research at the OECD has been a key tool in helping us develop our own trade and gender policies. I wanted to kind of start off by giving a bit of context in terms of what we're doing in Scotland to help businesses, and also to some of the participants that aren't familiar with devolution. I just want to provide a bit of background. So within the United Kingdom, the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament have powers to make laws and to deliver public services in devolved policy areas, many of them which have interactions with trade. Now, we work closely with the UK government, who are responsible for the regulation of the UK's international trade. And we have our own trade strategy as well, called the Vision for Trade. And this sets out some of those interactions by identifying the levers the Scottish Government has that can help improve the trading environment for businesses and ensure that people in Scotland benefit from international trade. And this includes increasing the participation of women-led businesses in exporting. And in doing so, we work really closely with the UK government on World Trade Organization business, and also we feed into the free trade agreement process. Scotland also has a strategy for export growth called A Trading Nation. And this strategy promotes Scottish exports, their goods and services in priority markets where Scotland has a competitive advantage. And we fund agencies such as Scottish Enterprise and its international division, Scotland Development International, which work with entrepreneurs and businesses to help them grow and overcome various barriers to exporting. Now, there is also more general business support available, including from Business Gateway, the Highlands and Islands Enterprise, and the South of Scotland Enterprise, including the Scottish Chamber of Commerce and other partner agencies. And the UK government also is providing support for businesses in Scotland. So the gender export gap research, well, we know that women-led businesses are less active in global markets compared to male counterparts. And a study from 2023, which the OECD OECD did found that only 15% of global export firms are led by women. And we also know that half of Scotland's population is female, but currently only 1 in 5 of Scotland's entrepreneurs are women, while startups funded by women in Scotland receive only 2% of overall investment capital. So in November of 2023, we brought together a group of stakeholders that included representatives of women-led businesses, academia, and the OECD. And as a result of that workshop and that engagement, we reviewed our existing data and looked at the levers that were available to the Scottish Government, and we focused our work on better understanding and addressing the gender export gap in Scotland. So to further inform that work, we commissioned a research study that was undertaken by Dr. Stephen Knox from the University of Stirling, Professor Noreen Arshed, and Dr. Carolina Marin Kadavid from the Universities of Strathclyde. And this research aimed to do two things. One, it had to make the economic case for addressing a known gender export gap in Scotland. So for us, there wasn't a question that there was a gender export gap. We knew that there was. It was trying to understand what the economic impact of that would be, and what opportunity that brought as well. And then the second part of the study was to suggest the most effective avenues for addressing that gender export gap. So really, what action can the Scottish Government and its delivery agencies take in this area to address the gap? I'm going to pass over to Dr. Stephen Knox, who's going to talk about the first part of the research study, which is about making this economic case and the findings from that. And then I'll come back and talk about the second part, which is the recommendations and how we're taking it forward.
So as Jane said, so we're in the backdrop of around about 20% of businesses are currently led by women in Scotland. To really dig into sort of the export potential behind this. So the first thing we did was we looked for a data set. We decided upon the longitudinal small business survey, sort of covers all sizes of SMEs. So the first question is, well, why SMEs when it comes to this? Because a lot of our trade currently done by larger corporations, the lion's share. But when it comes to portion of these larger corporations that are women-led, that number becomes very, very, very small. So that's why we sort of looked at the SMEs, and we do know from prior research for looking at SME growth. Growth SMEs are very important economically, and also exporting in general for SMEs is important for their growth. For those reasons, we looked at the longitudinal small business survey, covering all SME sizes, and we got the data from 2016 to 2022, so we can look across this time period. Within this, we're interested in really 4 categories of SME ownership based on gender. So the women-led refers to SMEs controlled by a single woman or having a management team of which majority are women. Equally led, where there's sort of that management team is equally mixed between women and men. Minority women-led refers to when the management team is predominantly male, and male-led refers to SMEs entirely controlled by men. So these sort of categories are important to bear in mind when we get a bit later on. In order to get a decent sample sizes, we combined the women-led and the equally-led categories together. So these are kind of important sort of categories to bear in mind. So our first step really was just to have a look at this data, to do some descriptive work to understand, well, what patterns are there? Is there a gender gap regards to SME in terms of exporting? And we sort of made 3 sort of observations from looking at this data. First is that there seems to be a double disadvantage. So obviously we know that the women-led SMEs are in the minority at 20%, but also there's a couple of other important sort of observations. So 21% of SMEs who export in Scotland are women-led. So about all the businesses that are currently exporting in our panel, only 21% of those women-led. in our latest year, 2022. However, that figure is historically lower. So we're looking at really in other years between 12 and 14%, as opposed to in 2022, 49% were male-led. Again, it was a bit lower historically, so it's usually higher, about 52, 59%. So we do see a gender difference there. And if we have a look at the Scottish women-led SMEs export, we get a figure of 15%. So 15% of all the women-led SMEs in our panel were exporting. Historically, that's kind of accurate. It's usually between 12 to 15% if we look across the years in the data that we had. The percentage of male-led SMEs, the export is a bit higher at 17 to 21%. So there's a bit of a gap there. We also found structural gaps, so in the characteristics in terms of the size with regards to turnover and also number of employees. So generally, women-led exporters turn over more than non-exporters, and then the male-led businesses there turn over more than women and equally led SMEs. So, males generally have these larger sized businesses in terms of turnover and employees. So there was a sort of a structural gap that was evident there. However, there was some interesting pattern that we picked up in terms of looking in terms of turnover sizes and number of employees, so an imperfect measure of productivity, but turnover amongst women equally led SMEs who export, while their number of employees is typically lower or about the same. So there's an indication there of productivity, which is something that dug into is sort of in the future to understand more about the productivity of these businesses who are exporting. So that's sort of the three main observations we got when we just sort of getting a feel for the data. So we wanted to build the economic case and really test to see whether an SME that starts to export is going to grow at a greater rate than an SME that doesn't export. So we designed our model. We used a conditional difference in difference approach, which is basically we matched a sample of exporters and non-exporters before and after an export point. So 2018, we took as the year that an SME entered export, and we were able to measure for 2 years after that if they grew relative to those non-exporting over the same time period to see the impact across two dependent variables, turnover and number of employees. We chose 2018 because we did notice some patterns there in our descriptives that were a bit off because of COVID starting 2020, sort of really hitting 22. So going up to the 2020 data provide us with a more sort of accurate picture there. A quick snapshot of the reports, and yes, as anticipated, exporting is particularly important for growth in Scotland, not just for women-led businesses, but also for male-led businesses. So if we have a look at our results, Scottish women-led, equally led SMEs increased turnover 2.2 million over 1 year and 3.6 million over 2 years relative to non-exporters. We didn't see any significant evidence for UK women-led and equally led increases. And when we compare that to males, so the Scottish male-led increased turnover 4.8 million in both 1 year and 2 years. So the coefficient there was same across almost the same across those 2 years. So we're seeing the male-led businesses are growing more after exporting compared to their non-exporters. So that was kind of not an unexpected finding. Previous research done actually by the Scottish Government in Enterprise Skills Review Period 2, so around 2019 time, showed that when looking at SME growth, exporting is particularly important for Scottish businesses. So we kind of expecting that, and we do also see that there is a bigger sort of growth increase for the male-led SMEs as opposed to women-led SMEs. In terms of the number of employees, we found no evidence that either Scottish or UK women-led, equally led SMEs increased the number of employees after entering the market. However, Scottish male-led SMEs do increase number of employees. However, it's not by very much, although it is greater than the rate of UK male-led SMEs. So basically, our conclusion from this was, yes, exporting super important, for SMEs in general in terms of growth, but for women-led businesses, absolutely really important for growth. So that's the sort of the economic case that we were able to make there. So I'll pass back now to Monika, who can show us the next part.
Thanks, Stephen. So this second part of our presentation refers to the second bit of the research, which was what can the Scottish Government look to do to try and address the gender export gap in Scotland. So there were semi-structured individual interviews that were held with 3 groups of participants, women exporters, women entrepreneurs who were not exporting, and then those agencies that I mentioned earlier on in my presentation that provide support for exporting in Scotland. So the findings and barriers from this part of the study might be familiar to some of you on this call. They include things such as a lack of awareness of training programs, lack of access to finance and women's networks, gender stereotypes was also mentioned, caring responsibilities, and a general negative perception of exporting. The research found no significant differences in the barriers in terms of goods and services. Like a main difference was that exporters of services reported they had more flexibility to decide where to be located physically than exporters of goods. However, one of the unique findings of the study that I did want to highlight was the barrier to exporting posed by the United Kingdom leaving the EU. So this research found that there has been a significant obstacle for women-led businesses, with some having to halt sales to Europe and others reporting declining sales because of product price increases. So cosmetics, clothing, and textile sectors in particular, where women are overrepresented, were highly affected by the UK exiting the EU. So in terms of the recommendations, there are 10 recommendations in the report on how the Scottish Government can address the gender export gap in collaboration with its stakeholders. You'll see on the slide that there are 6 that are color-coded in purple. So these are the 6 that we have identified after doing an initial assessment that we want to take forward immediately. And they include raising awareness of exporting opportunities, better targeting women-led businesses for foundation training programs, including more women in trade missions, and increasing the exposure of women's networks, just to name a few there. As I mentioned at the start of the presentation, the Scottish Government, through its enterprise agencies, offers comprehensive tailored support to businesses' needs. And we are looking at how this support can be better targeted to include more women-led businesses. So we are taking forward the recommendations on collecting gender segregated data as well for exporting. And I know that that's an issue for a lot of organizations as well, and a common challenge across the board. And finally, the kind of last recommendation 10 that you see there. So this is a recommendation about joining up work that the Scottish Government is doing on women entrepreneurship, particularly the Pathways Women in Entrepreneurship report, which was published in 2023, which seeks to address the root causes of female under participation in entrepreneurship. So we're kind of trying to see how to kind of marry up the 2 reports together. So next steps. So our Minister for Business and Employment, that you can see there in the photo, he launched the report and the Scottish Government's response to it on the 7th of February this year. The response to the report has been overall positive, I would say, with the stakeholders and media recognizing the importance of addressing the gender export gap. And delivering on the report and the recommendations is now a priority in the Scottish Government programme for government for this year, which which is really a firm commitment from the Scottish Government to address this issue. We have, the way we've kind of gone about this, so the report was published, and we've now established a working group that includes the delivery agencies that I mentioned earlier. And it also includes key Scottish Government officials that will play a pivotal role in implementing these recommendations. And the group is directly accountable to the Minister for Business and Employment. What we're kind of currently making our way through is thinking through the process of how we will monitor progress in a kind of meaningful way. But we are intending to provide an update on where we've got to with implementing the recommendations of this report in our next Vision for Trade annual report that will hopefully be published at the end of this year. So that's all from me.
Yeah, thank you so much, Monika and Stephen. Very interesting report. Please, Jane, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much. So that was a fascinating presentation on gender export gaps and how Scotland is responding to those. That's very interesting, in particular, since at the OECD we've done quite a bit of work on trade and gender, and how to close gender export gaps. And one of the things that we point to is the importance of having granular gender differentiated data to be able to better understand who is exporting, what kind of enterprises, what challenges do they face, in order to really well target policies to respond to those. So I'll tell a little bit about some of the research that we've been doing in different regions and different areas of the world. And some of it, overlaps with the findings in Scotland. Some of it is kind of complementary. But what we find in general is, as you found in Scotland, women are underrepresented in trade. This is both as employees, workers, and also as business leaders. There are a number of reasons for that. Women generally work and lead businesses in industries that are less traded, in particular services, and in particular services that are less traded, like health, education, and public administration. And yet, we know that trade-related jobs are higher skilled and they pay better, and they are in more productive firms, which means that, women are losing out on those trade-related jobs. And as entrepreneurs and business leaders, they are losing out on those economies of scale and those, productivity gains that they get from entering onto international markets. We also know that, there is an entrepreneurship gap. As you find in Scotland, fewer women are leading businesses than men. So we looked into this in Latin America, for example, where less than 1/4 of firms in Latin America are led by women. And when we survey, women entrepreneurs, they often say that they feel that they do not have the requisite skills for, going out into entrepreneurship and entering onto international markets. So we looked at the gender export gap, in a number of contexts. This is some of the work that I did for the G20. So in the G20, 12% of women-led businesses and 19% of men-led firms export. So, that gender gap is significant. And just for comparison, in the OECD, it's 13% of women-led businesses and 24% of men-led businesses export. So in Scotland, from the numbers that you showed, there's a little bit less of a gender gap. Women-led firms seem to export a little bit more, 15% you found, compared with 17 to 21% of men-led firms exporting. So what we looked at in the work for the G20, for Latin America, as well as for the OECD, we did a gap analysis, and we tried to tease out what are the different factors driving that gender export gap. And in general, so the figures here on the graph are for the G20, but in general, what we find is we can explain the gender export gap. A little bit over a third of that gap can be explained by the fact that women work in lead businesses in industries that are less traded. A little bit under a third of that gap can be explained by the fact that their businesses are smaller. But they're smaller and less well financed. But a substantial amount of that gender export gap we cannot explain by firm characteristics. And so this is things like, unconscious bias. This is a survey that we conducted along with the G20. But we also have an OECD Facebook survey, so that we did it in conjunction with Facebook and with the World Bank, asking women entrepreneurs what actually their challenges are to exporting. We found, is there are quite a number of them. One is lack of information. For example, lack of information about foreign markets, about export and import procedures. And some of this information can come to women entrepreneurs through informal professional networks that we know women have more shallow professional networks. So this might be an area where some policies could, bridge some of those gaps. And of course, as you mentioned, women-led firms have less access to capital, both credit and equity, which means that they generally do not scale up their businesses as quickly as men do. In some countries that we looked at in the G20 and in Latin America, costly transport and logistics decreased exporters' competitivity, and particularly, those smaller women-led firms who are maybe working with smaller margins than some of the larger firms. And then we found some others that maybe are a little bit less relevant for Scotland, which is, for example, costly or unreliable internet access, which is kind of a prerequisite to trading in on international markets today. And in some countries, in particular in Latin America, we found that women-led businesses are more likely to be in the informal sector. So this shows you the challenges that women business leaders face in Latin America. So, that second set of bars, where, for example, women business leaders are more likely to say that they have trouble understanding foreign markets and knowing how to, overcome any regulation, how to respond to border procedure regulations and requirements. And this may be, women may be saying this, citing this as a challenge more frequently, in part because of those shallower professional networks. But another thing that I wanted to point out, so this slide shows the challenges women business leaders face in 7 countries of Latin America. And one of those is Colombia. And we looked in particular, doing some work in Colombia, at the specific challenges that women business leaders face in Colombia. And we found that they're actually quite different. And so, they're quite different, in one country compared with its neighbors. And that also speaks to the importance of having detailed, granular, gender-specific data for, regions and countries in order to target policy more better, right? And for example, take a look at that, the fourth set of bars on internet access in Colombia. About 15% of Colombian women business leaders said that they have trouble accessing the internet at affordable rates, and compared with very few men-led businesses. And that is something that is specific to Colombia. So it just kind of shows the importance of having this kind of granular analysis that you have undertaken. What we are, the question then is, what do we do about closing these gaps? So at the OECD, we have been, increasing the evidence base. We have a set of OECD trade and gender reviews. We did a trade and gender review of New Zealand, was our pilot. And then we've done a trade and gender review of Latin America, 7 countries in Latin America. And in these reviews, we examine the engagement in trade-related jobs in terms of employment and entrepreneurship. We look at the trade impacts of on the purchasing power of different types of households. And we analyze trade policies that are most relevant to women and recommend policies that countries can undertake to ensure more support to women through trade. And there are a number of policy areas that we make recommendations. And a number of those are, right here on the screen, and I'll just go into a couple of examples. So what we find, women-led firms tend to be smaller than men-led firms. And, as a general rule, trade policies that support micro and small enterprises also support women-owned firms. So that's in particular trade facilitation, in particular automation of border procedures, reforms that reduce time required to trade. It also refers to transparency and regulation, and supporting an environment conducive to lowering trade costs. And this was also pointed out in the previous presentation from Scotland. So the OECD collects trade facilitation indicators for about 100 countries of the world. The one shown here in red is the United Kingdom. And you can compare with best practice, which is the best practice in each of the indicators out of the 100 or so countries in green. And so we can look at specific indicators in specific countries and suggest where they may undertake trade facilitation reforms. For example, in the UK, the biggest gaps between the UK performance and best practice is in, for example, border agency cooperation and automation. And there are a number of sub-indicators behind each of these that will show exactly, where those differences are. Another type of recommendation that we had to do with trade promotion, and I saw this was on that list of the 10 recommendations for Scotland as well. And these, are really look to overcome some of the challenges found, when we undertook our review of New Zealand, and which are similar to some of those in Scotland. And so we worked with the New Zealand Trade and Enterprise, New Zealand's export promotion agency, to suggest a number of recommendations. And some of those are, for example, just being more intentional about targeting women-led firms for export promotion advisory services. So, for example, when we started the review, there was no actual counting of how many firms that received support from the Export Promotion Agency were led by women. They found out then that there were 16%. So 16% of the firms that received export promotion advisory services and support were led by women. So they then put into place a target to double the number of women in firms supported by their export promotion agency in the following 3 years. And from what I understand, they are well on the way to doing that. And, they also were more intentional of looking into what sectors women typically own businesses that are export ready or that already export. And so they make sure that they have advisors in those sectors and enough support in those specific sectors to actually respond to that kind of demand. And another area of policy recommendation that we did in our reviews that was maybe less a part of the Scottish study is looking into trade agreements that countries are undertaking and the gender-related provisions in those trade agreements. Trade agreements are a key policy, are a key tool in the trade policy toolbox. And so in Latin America, for example, we looked at which trade agreements they had undertaken that have specific provisions targeting women in trade and, supporting and facilitating their entry onto international markets. And, we looked through those gender-related provisions and, made recommendations to have them, expanded, enhanced, better implemented, and a number of recommendations so that, that tool in the policy toolbox is better used. So that's just a little bit of, gives you a little taste of what we're doing here at the OECD, working with other countries, within OECD, outside OECD. And so, as you can see, some of the recommendations are complementary, are similar to the ones that Scotland is undertaking. But I just want to, say really congratulations for having undertaken such a detailed study, which, is definitely the first step to targeting policy to support women in their export journey. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Jane, for the presentation, and thank you all the speakers for very nice presentations and insightful discussions. While we're waiting for the questions, maybe I can start with the first question. The question is about the report, and I was wondering, so I understand that it's about encouraging and facilitating trade for women that are already working and somehow would like to trade if they cannot. But I was wondering if we take a step back and do you think also encouraging women who are not working but would like to work, I mean, who are not participating in the labor force already, but because of caregiving responsibilities or because of similar limitations. So if we take a step back and if we could encourage them to start working even before focusing on the trading part, do you think that would make a difference? Or if so, how can it be done?
Yeah, I'm happy to come in. That's right. Thanks. That's an interesting kind of take on that. I would say that some of the agencies that are involved in this work, and certainly when we were looking at the recommendations, especially the one around raising awareness, and we were kind of looking at the whole kind of package that our delivery agencies provide, and we have found that, for example, a number of our agencies do provide kind of tools, whether it's online tools or there's information out there for women that aren't necessarily in exporting or own their own business, but there's information out there on how to start your own business and how to get the support that you need, and there's training programs as well. So I feel even if we kind of raise awareness of exporting, kind of the research did focus on women that already have established business and are exporting, but even if we kind of start raising awareness of exporting more generally, we would perhaps also be able to get women into establishing their own business as well. And I think this is also partly captured with the work that my colleagues are doing on entrepreneurship and implementing the recommendations from the Pathways report that kind of looks at getting more women to establish their own business.
I can add to that. So I think, what we find is that there can be a positive spiral, right? So what we find in many European countries, for example, is that women-led firms employ more women. So, by having more women in entrepreneurship, you will also have, more opportunities for women in the labor market. As women, there has been a glass ceiling in, most countries, probably all countries of the world. And, as women move up in the hierarchy and go into executive positions and, are more engaged in, strategic planning and, more engaged in, managing people, finances, resources, and have experience going on to international markets, they gain that experience that they will need as a business leader. And so, if there is a glass ceiling already in the labor market, they don't necessarily, have access to those skills. And many women say that they feel they don't have the skills to go into entrepreneurship. Part of that is probably the glass ceiling. So, it's kind of a positive spiral between entrepreneurship and, labor force participation and, breaking down those barriers in the labor market, which will then allow probably more women to go on to international markets. So I think, I take your point, right? More women in the labor market, more women in entrepreneurship, fewer barriers will have a positive effect on, the entire economy.
Yeah, like a positive spillover and maybe a multiplier effect. Thank you. And so I was wondering also, do you think so? I mean, regarding the policy recommendations, maybe I missed it, but do you think also some subsidies maybe for caregiving responsibilities for women would help them participate in export markets, or also in it's a bit related to the first question, labor markets as well, because although maybe it's much more equal if we compare to like previous decades in terms of caregiving responsibilities between men and women, we still know that it's not perfectly equally distributed, if I can put it that way. So do you think, I'm asking all the speakers from the Scottish point of view and also maybe from the more like broader OECD point of view, do you think maybe like subsidies or some like other supports in terms of these caregiving responsibilities for the elderly or for children would make a significant impact on women's participation in international markets as well as labor markets?
Yeah, so I can start there. We've looked into this question, of unpaid work in the study that we did on Latin America, for example. And in some countries, so women, do 2 to 3 times the amount of unpaid work that men do. And plus, in Latin America, the working hours are very long. So it's very difficult, for women to, have a full-time job and, respond to all of these unpaid activities. So, for sure, the recommendation that we have is, the need for available and affordable childcare, whatever form that comes in. You're suggesting a subsidy. So in France, for example, they had a tax rebate for, services, domestic services in the home, childcare. And, in many countries with high shares of women in the labor market, they have, subsidized childcare, municipal subsidized childcare, for example. So, that's a big one, right? It's childcare, it's elder care, but it's also housework, domestic chores, and all of these things that take up a lot of time that, takes away from the amount of hours that women devote to paid work. And another aspect is, so there's this really recent paper that came out on, gender wage gaps. So we know that the gender wage gap is, starts fairly small, and then at the childbearing years increases. They did some regressions using some data on LinkedIn, massive amounts of data, and found that some of this higher wage gap was because women during the childbearing years were not adding skills, right? So maybe they were doing kind of the bare minimum to get their work done, but they were not increasing their human capital, right? And which will then be, something where they can advance their career and so on, which is another, aspect just about that, unpaid work that's very difficult to measure, although somebody seems to have done it.
Jump in here from the report in Scotland. So childcare was one of so my colleagues in their qualitative work did unpack this. Childcare was sort of a big barrier for why some entrepreneurs couldn't, for example, attend network evenings, couldn't go on trade missions, or reluctant to go on trade missions for 4 or 5 days a week away from those caring responsibilities. And we're in a context in Scotland where there is subsidized childcare. So I think it's at the nursery level. Monika will be able to correct me as obviously being in the Scottish government. So we do have subsidized childcare to some degree, but nurseries are open during traditional work hours, and entrepreneurs' work hours don't necessarily cover that. And it's also sort of as a big barrier for the trade missions. And trade missions is where you can go make sales, make connections, supply chains. It's really important for exporting. There's an organization in Scotland called Investing Women who organize trade missions for groups of women entrepreneurs. And one of the ways that they can do this is initially through virtual missions, which are much more convenient to work in with these sort of childcare responsibilities and other caring responsibilities. And it's a good way to introduce these people that aren't exporting, that maybe want to, without that massive time commitment. And they can say, yes, this we value. I'll go on a trade mission. It's an investment of my time for that week to go to the US or wherever the trade mission may be. So that's sort of a good sort of intermediary step for this sort of should we subsidize childcare or not debate, which I think has been quite common in Scottish government circles for the women's enterprise work for quite some time. Monika.
Yeah, conscious of time, so I'll keep my contribution brief. But yes, there is subsidised childcare funding in Scotland. It's primarily for preschool children, so 3 to 5 year olds, and works out at around 22 hours a week. But just what I did want to add on that, like building on Stephen's point there, I remember I attended an event last year, and towards the end of the event, one of the women stood up and said, "Thank you for starting this seminar at 10 o'clock, because if it would have started at 9, I wouldn't be here because I had to drop my kids off at school." So and it was this kind of realization that even these kind of minor changes to, I don't know, a start time, or as Stephen had said, having the option of virtual trade missions does make a difference to women kind of engaging and participating in these opportunities. So that's just a brief point I want to make, and just to kind of flag that, yes, childcare and caring responsibilities are very much included in the report. There's not a specific action around that. However, the working group that we established is conscious of that, and it was briefly discussed at the last meeting, so it is very much on our radar.
Ask a question for Jane, is that all right?
Yeah, of course, please go ahead.
Jane, I was just wondering, in your research of OECD countries, have you come across a particular country that's doing very valuable work in this area, and you're seeing results? Have you seen any particular success stories?
So we work very closely with New Zealand on this trade and gender review of New Zealand. And they were, already before we started the review, they were ranked 4th worldwide in terms of gender equality, according to the World Economic Forum. So, as a friend of mine said, you're telling LeBron James how to play basketball, but what I told them is that in terms of gender equality, there's no LeBron James. So even New Zealand, which is number 4 in the world, there are many things that can be done, and there are still many gender gaps. And that was a great collaboration, because they put into place a lot of new policy, new programs, supporting women entrepreneurs, women exporters. They were definitely doing a lot of very interesting things, and starting to, like the example that I gave with the Export Promotion Agency, starting to measure, what was the increase in the exports, of women-led firms. And this was part of, a bigger push to export, which is one of the main policy priorities of the entire government, where they want to increase export, double exports in, I don't know, 5 or 10 years, And so they're looking to, increase, lower those barriers to export wherever they can. And this is a little bit of a low-hanging fruit, right? How when you're talking about doubling your exports, that is a tough thing to do. And, if it just means, supporting some women-led firms who need a little extra information, et cetera, in order to go on to international markets, that's a pretty inexpensive way to increase your exports. In Latin America, they're also, they have quite a few programs to support women business leaders, and either government-led programs, or we were looking in Colombia, for example. They have an incredible kind of professional network, and within this, huge business network, that their members, make up something like 50% of GDP. And, within that, they have a very strong, kind of support network of women entrepreneurs in particular. And, when these women entrepreneurs, need more information about something, they go out and try and, fill those gaps. I mean, there's a lot of interesting, good practice out there. Now, actually, saying that particular policy led to X% of exports, it's hard to make the direct link, right? It's hard to say, even when you're talking about trade missions, we took 10 women on trade missions. How many contracts came out of that? It's usually a number of things, right? They made new contacts. They explored a market that maybe they had already started. I mean, the actual causation is really hard to establish, but the correlation is there.
All right. So thank you very much to all our panelists, speakers for the presentations, and thank you all the participants for joining us in this discussion. Bye.